Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today what I'm going to show you is one method that you can use to paint the Hearthkyn of the Trans-Hyperian Alliance from the Leagues of Votann. Now bright orange armor always looks incredible on the table, and I'll be honest with you, this uses a few more paints than would normally be the case with one of my guides, because I really wanted to make sure the first time we took this out of the park and had a bit of a play around with something as bright as this, that it would look good. So all of the paints will be listed in the description, and there's one or two parts I think you'll see where you can skip a couple of steps that I'm going to use today. Now if you do notice I sound a little different to usual, I'm still getting over a cold, so hopefully that won't bother you too much. But all the same, let's get started. Now just before we get to the part on painting, I want to talk really quickly about assembly, because you'll notice straight away I have a Headless Hearthkyn, and it's not a Halloween joke, this is just going to make it much easier to reach up under the back of the suit here, where the head's going to be, whereas over here, creepy as it is, grab yourself a bunch of hat maker or dressmaking pins, jam them in the top of a cork, and just trim the ends off. Then you can drill a little hole in the bottom of the head and mount those. Now, this is great because it also lets you prime the heads with a different color if you want to. In this instance, Wraithbone's going to be perfect for both, but for example with Space Marine helmets or something similar, you might want to prime them white while you're priming the Marine itself a different color. Just something to bear in mind. Once I'm finished with the painting, I'll be able to varnish this, pop the head off, and then dab it in there with a little bit of PVA. It'll take slightly longer to dry, but it won't frost or ghost around the edges like superglue could. But however you have assembled your miniature, I've then gone ahead and hit this with a primer spray of Wraithbone. Now I experimented first of all by playing around over the top of white, but it was just a little too light. The Wraithbone primer is going to give us a bit of warmth, which I think is still going to be important to the armor. Interestingly enough, all of the armor recipes I've seen other people doing are all different, so steal what you like from this, adapt it as necessary. I'm just going to show you what I like the look of, and I have done another orange armor tutorial, which I'll link in the description. But let's crack on with this little fella here. The way that I find easiest to apply contrast is to have more on my brush than I think I'm going to need, and once it's on, move it around. Don't just splat it down and leave it and assume it's going to do all of the work for you. You see, by having more on my brush, I have an opportunity to see how it's going to settle first, rather than trying to drag it around and ending up with really patchy finishes in places. And I'm also deliberately going over the edges of areas that I know aren't going to be orange, because again, it'll be easier to tidy those up later then get a perfect result here and make that more difficult. Now as that dries, it's not going to look anywhere near as dark as when it's being applied, but we can still make it a little bit lighter. Just briefly touching on the fact, you want to make sure you're applying plenty at a time, because if you put too much on, you can shift it around with your brush and then wick it away, which will give you a smoother finish than if you put on a streak, a line of contrast. If you have to go back to the pot and add more, you're already going to be creating tide marks. So use more than you might think. To dry brush this fella's armor, what I've got here is Lugganath Orange. Now I would suggest, if you can still get it, grab some Kindle Flame. That has been discontinued unfortunately, which is why I'm using Lugganath Orange instead, but it would still be my choice if you can find it anywhere. With any old small dry brush that you like using, what we'll do is just lightly flick along the edges to give us a nice, sharp highlight. You can do this on the shoulder pads too. Just take your time and go over the same area a few times, and you'll pick up that edge nice and easy. You can do this along all of the orange armor. And as always with dry brushing, it's more important that you have got too little on your brush than too much, because too little, you can add more. Too much, oh dear, you got to start over. Now once that's finished, you've got a little bit more depth there, and that's looking really cool. If we want to make that highlight even sharper later, we can return to Lugganath Orange and apply it at some high points and corners with a small brush, but for a dry brush, that'll do. We'll move on now. This is Karak stone. And same as a lot of the other colors, everybody's got a slightly different view of what this leather should look like, but it does look quite pale in most of the shots I've seen. So that's what I'm going to use. This being a layer paint, you'll probably find once you've laid down one layer, you're going to need to let it dry, come back and apply a second later on. Okay, whoops, stop. Nope, don't do that. Don't listen to me. What we're going to do instead is, first of all, lay down some Mechanica Standard Grey on the undersuit, because that's going to be easier to reach before we get to the leather. So take your time when you get up close to the parts of the armor that you've already painted. And I'm going to quickly flick around here. You see, particularly on the back, I could get in here without hitting those leather straps, but it's going to be more likely that I just get this on, make a mistake or two, and then tidy up the leather later. Now that likely will take 2 coats, so make sure you're a little patient and let the first coat dry. And then we can go back to our Karak stone and finish off that leather. When it comes to the black details, you've got a couple of choices. You could use a typical acrylic paint like Abaddon Black, but here I've got Black Legion, and this, it's fun to use. It covers so well for a contrast color, and you get just a little bit of that ghosting at the edges of detail where you'll see some of that contrast highlighting effect. So I'm going to go over all of the black details, so his gun, sections on his pack. If I need to, if I want to darken down anywhere, I'll go over it with a second coat, just avoiding the edges so I keep that little bit of highlighting. And as well, don't forget the neck joint on the armor. Now we'll use Iron Hand Steel to start painting in the metallic details. I like using a short synthetic brush for most of these, so whether it's one of the white-handled STC brushes or what have you, won't matter too much. Just something that you can really stick into some of these gaps. Swap to a smaller brush as you might need though. Especially over Wraithbone, that is going to give us a really bright silver, which is really nice. I've now got Garagak Sewer, and I'm going to use this to apply over the little anklets that this figure is wearing. There's nothing saying that you couldn't paint this in the same color as the leather. I just think they look better a little bit darker. And then just a tiny wee splodge of Retributor armor. Now there is one detail on this miniature that I cannot reach with the brush and we actually can't see, and that's the little lamp on her chest. So what I'd suggest, you could hit that with a couple of little dots of white scar and then give it some Aethermatic blue or something over the top. But in this case, we can't see it, so we're not going to do it. Now at this point, ordinarily, we might go for Nuln Oil, but instead what I've got here, we're going to use Basilicanum Grey in a very similar way. The bonus here is we're going to go over all of the metal and the grey stuff on the trousers and undersuit. Maybe a bit much there. And this is going to give us a really deep, nice shade. Bonus being you can go straight over the top of the black and it won't matter. And at this stage, over all of the metal as well. And then a little bit of Agrax Earthshade we can use over the leather stuff. Now that leather's looking a little more interesting, but there is a detail I actually quite forgot, and that is going to be the buttons or keyboards or what have you on this little wrist doofer. So I'm going to just cover over it with some pink horror. I'm going to use quite a small brush here. And then we'll essentially shade it with some Volupus pink. You're not going to need very much of this at all, so just pop it on there, guide it to the edges, and then we'll let that dry. And then if you want to highlight those, you can add just a little dot of white into your pink horror from earlier. Let's get that at the right angle, and just blip at the edges to give that a little bit more shape. Now from here, any other highlights that you choose to do are really up to you. I'm going back to some Mechanica Standard Grey from earlier, and what I'm going to do is pick out the larger, sort of puffier parts of the undersuit and just brighten them up a little bit. The depth I don't want to lose by painting this into the recesses, but yeah, this is pretty dark, so I figure we can add a little bit more visual interest here. Now that'll be a little difficult to see on camera, just owing to the way that this is still a little bit shiny. But in person, that's pretty cool. You don't have to do much of it, but I do think it's going to add quite a bit to your miniature. Speaking of though, I've got here Dawnstone Dry, and another one of my little cheap dry brushes that I've picked up over the years. Remember, always check out the stationery aisle in your supermarket or similar, because you'll find really, really cheap, nasty brushes, which make great little dry brushes for stuff like this. So I'm going to catch the edges on the black. Now you can go over all of the black with that. So the gun, the backpack, and the knee pads and boots, all of it, it will look fine. What I've got now is some Ushabti bone, and I've thinned this down, and we're going to go with this with a very small brush. Just a few little spots at the edges of some of the orange details, just to make this look a little brighter. Now you don't want to overdo this because it will very quickly make your orange look yellow, but just by catching with the edge of your brush in some areas where you want a highlight, or a sharper highlight rather, you can use your dry brush as a guide here, and anywhere that you've struggled to catch with the dry brush, you can brighten them up a little bit further here with the Ushabti bone. And then finally, we're going to use some Vallejo Model Air Chrome to highlight the metal. Now you can use Stormhost Silver if that's what you've got. I just tend to find this flows a little more smoothly off my brush and doesn't tend to separate quite as much. So just a few little slashes of this here and there to brighten up your metalwork. You can also use a little bit of that same silver color in ragged little scratchy shapes just to ding up the rifle a little bit. I always think that looks really cool. It's up to you whether or not your Leagues of Votann are going to take better care of their equipment. But from a visual perspective, I think it adds a bit to the miniature. But luckily, that's really the body done from here. So what we'll do is turn now to the head. And wonderfully, this is going to be nice and quick to do. So grab yourself whichever of the flesh tones you want to use. I've got here Guilliman Flesh, and we're going to apply this all over the skin. Try and slow down a little and just touch the edges of where the hair is going to be. But otherwise, lay down a coat. Don't let it blob too much around the eyes. And we'll come back once this is dried. Beautiful thing about contrast is that you can quite happily just leave that as it is, particularly if you are knocking out large units of infantry. But I've got some flayed one flesh, and what I'm going to do is just lighten up her cheekbones, ears, and brows a little. Now instead, I ended up going over most of her skin with that, so let's make her even a little more pale, and I've got here Pallid Witch Flesh. This time, I am really going to concentrate just on the tip of her nose, her eyebrows, her chin, and what have you. Just those final bits of colour. Then we'll pick a contrast colour to paint in her hair. Now I've decided I'm going to use a Garros Dunes here. And finally here, with some Screaming Skull, we'll just touch in the edges of her hair to make this look a little bit lighter. Now into the head socket there, I've got just a little bit of PVA, and I'm going to jab that in there. Like I said, you can use super glue if you want to, but this is going to give us a little bit more time to work it. And any overspill we get is also going to dry clear. And then we'll just pop the head into place and start nudging that around until it gets to the position that we want. Now, like I said, that'll dry clear, and that's looking pretty good. From here, what we can do is the last step that we need to paint, and that is going to be these white stripes. I've got here Corax White, and as always, I recommend a little bit of medium in your pot when you first get it, along with a couple of agitators. Make sure that you're shaking it thoroughly between each use. Whew, and away we go. So, painting a straight line. Don't worry about painting straight. Just start moving your brush in the same direction until you get a mostly straight edge, and you can start bulking it out as you go. Now to get the other side, flip her upside down and approach from the different direction. you'll find it easier going at it this way. Now that'll look the business. Once you've laid down the first coat and straightened out the lines, you can put a second over the top and get a nice solid color. But we are going to go the whole way and add white scar over the top. Make sure that this is really shining. The last thing I'm going to do is to apply some decals, and I'm going to go ahead and pop a base on her, the recipe for which will be in the description. Now, I've done a whole video on doing decals before. Suffice to say, the more recent decal sheets from Citadel are really good. I haven't found it necessary to lay down a varnish first, but I am going to varnish her once she's finished. So let's get a look at what she looks like when she is all done. And there at last, our Hearthkyn is complete. And I had a lot of fun painting her. It's something really far outside my usual wheelhouse when you consider that really it's not all that different from painting a Space Marine. There's a lot of armor and, well, maybe more like a scout. Armor and some soft undersuit, but there's a lot going on there. So if you wanted to speed up the process, maybe skipping a couple of the highlights or using lighter colors than I did, maybe Dawnstone for the undersuit, and then shade it the same way I did, it's up to you. Something to have a bit of a play around with. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.